Japan's brand new prime minister just made China seriously angry. During a parliamentary hearing on November 7th, Sanae Takaichi said in relation to a potential Chinese blockade of Taiwan that if warships are used and other armed actions are involved, I believe this could constitute a survival-threatening crisis. China reacted fiercely, including official protests, threats, and a travel advisory to avoid all trips to Japan. Even the stock markets are now reacting negatively. Here to discuss what is happening and why this sentence is such a huge problem is Dr. Joanna Lei, a former lawmaker in the Republic of China, that is the government of Taiwan, and a great friend of inner Chinese peace and reconciliation. Joanna, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal. You picked the right time for a very serious topic.
It's a very, very bad topic, actually, and I'm very surprised by how this all blew up. Can you maybe tell us, first, what exactly happened and why is it that China is reacting in the way it is?
I think there are a couple of really important points. Takaichi's statement is her official statement as a prime minister in the Diets. And it is also the first time Japan moved away from some kind of strategic ambiguity and made a very clear statement that what happens in Taiwan on the Taiwan Strait, even in a blockade situation, would constitute a survival threat for Japan, which would give Japan a right to intervene militarily. So all of these are first. They're the first time ever after the Second World War or in recent years that something like this has happened and made officially in the Diet. So China reacted strongly. Taiwan's DPP, the pro-independence and pro-Japan faction, reacted jubilantly. So I think there are real reasons that this is not just a diplomatic hiccup, but a very serious issue.
And the thing for Japan is that the sentence survival-threatening situation would mean that it would give the prime minister the power to dispatch the self-defense forces also in collective self-defense with other allies, meaning the United States and Taiwan. China is now officially saying that this is an inadmissible way of interfering in inner Chinese issues. Do you think the Chinese are overreacting, or was this to be expected?
I think there are long historical wounds caused by Japanese military expansion towards China, causing wars against China, starting from 1895 and also more recently in 1931 to 1945. So those wars has caused China, either the Qing dynasty China or the current Chinese government, huge wounds that's opened by this simple statement. In addition, they were very careful. They told people what it meant to be considered a survival threat, because Japan has used that in its past aggression toward China, in its past aggression in the Pearl Harbor situation. So once this term is used and linking Taiwan Strait and situation in Taiwan to Japan's survival threat, it gives a very strong signal of potential military intervention. And that, of course, is not something that we've heard of before. And that is why the reaction is strong, swift, and decisive.
The thing that I believe is not clear here in Japan and probably outside as well is just how hurtful it is for Chinese ears to hear this sentence of survival-threatening crisis or existential crisis, because this sentence goes back to the Second World War. Can you maybe speak to that a bit?
Yeah, actually, before the major military confrontation in the Second World War, Japan used this survival threat as the reason to wage military attack towards China. And from that, you understand that the Second World War, either using a 14-year time period or a full 8-year time period, has caused over 30 million casualties or deaths in China, as well as countless destruction of properties and infrastructure. So these has been used as real warning signs for Japan never to wage military aggression towards other regions in Asia Pacific. And that is exactly why after the war, Japan has a quote unquote peace constitution written by the then American General Command. And also that is why Japan has Article 9 is quote unquote peace constitution. So with Takaishi stating this in the Diet and signaling that she is contemplating changes of other related clauses and other laws with regard to the military, it's just signaling that the militarism that haunted Asia, that was in Japan's past, seemed to be reviving. And that revival caused huge shockwaves in China.
One thing Takaichi didn't do since she became the new prime minister was to visit the Yasukuni shrine, this war criminal shrine. She sent flowers instead of going there, but she didn't go herself. How do you explain to yourself that she's now making such a rhetoric in parliament?
Well, certainly she has acquiesced in terms of going to Yasukuni shrine. We've maintained the position, both people in PRC and people in Taiwan who has followed governments that fought the Second World War have long insisted that those 14 Class A war criminals are the reason why we reject any Japanese politicians going to Yasukuni shrine. So I think Takaichi understands the severity of that and she acquiesced. However, she has a long-term plan, both in her campaign and in her actions as a prime minister, to quote-unquote mobilize Japan. That is to have Japan's self-defense as a full military, that has Japan release its restrictions from military expansion outside of the full island territory, and that she's thinking of reviving related laws with regard to the use of nuclear-related powers. So all of these are sending really, really strong signal that she has a destiny that she's following. She may take different steps. She may sometimes acquiesce. But this new statement, especially made in the Diet, sent very, very strong signal and is a warning sign to countries in Asia Pacific that was once occupied or militarily controlled by Japan.
One of the frustrating things about this comment was that it was made in reply to a parliamentarian from the left wing who actually pressed her on the issue and wanted her to answer in the negative. But she didn't. She answered in the positive, and she made that statement. Is this also being taken into consideration at the moment that this also was in reply to a question in China, or is the Chinese, especially social media sphere, interpreting it as an intentional provocation that came out of a deliberate plan to provoke?
Well, I think we need to look at the time sequence or the sequence of events. You may interpret the original statement as a reaction. It could be a setup, or it could be some kind of collaboration between the two. But being as it may, after that, there were numerous accounts and numerous situations that China has asked her to perhaps retract the statement, or she can restate the statement, but she has refused to do that. And with the diplomatic pressure first exerted in both Japan and in Beijing, as well as the follow-on travel advisories and the new military drills, live ammunition drills in the nearby territories, in the nearby ocean territory, maritime territories, all have indicated how serious and how severe the situation might be. But there is no retraction from her or from her party, and there seemingly has no changing of the position. So perhaps the original statement may be a setup, but the follow-on reactions, one after another, especially one after another waves, seem to be indicating that she is holding steadfast on this position.
Yes, that's certainly true, because there was as you said, no attempt even at walking something of this back, even after it got clear how severe it is being interpreted on the other side. One more thing is that a Chinese friend of mine told me, from a Chinese view, this is Japan inserting itself uselessly into a problem which is none of its problems. Do you also interpret it this way?
Well, certainly that's indicating what may happen across the Taiwan Strait. That you may have to take into account of what Taiwan, especially Lai Ching-te government, is doing. Within Taiwan, certainly the reaction is divided. One part is extremely welcoming and celebratory. The other part is worrying and feeling that this may cause huge problems in terms of our relationship across Taiwan Strait. Lai Ching-te has long taken the position that the heyday of Taiwan was those under Japanese rule, and his independence proposals would in some way count on U.S. and Japan military support should there be a Taiwan independence proclamation or movements toward that, and should there be a military aggression from PRC. So when Takaishi walked directly into this line, Lai Ching-te and his government and some of the people that supported them also taking the sort of royalist Japanese former colonist position, welcome this with jubilee. So it is not surprising that China would take this as an indirect support or maybe explicit support of a Taiwan independence movement or advocacy, because it is reacted and received in Taiwan just as that.
The situation is further complicated, in my view, by the relative silence of the United States, that is not trying to say like, please calm it down. The United States seems to be just, let it go, because obviously a worsening of relations between Tokyo and Beijing is in direct favor of Washington. How do you think the Chinese are factoring this one in to the response that they're giving now?
Well, if you go back to the origin of the peace constitution, quote unquote, and the Article 9, it is exactly or precisely to contain Japan from making such a move or statement or action in the sense that may urge the other side in Asia Pacific to move in a military escalation. So now, if this has been reacted with such a strong opposition, it is probably natural for PRC to expect U.S. to make certain statement, but it didn't. And I think in recent years, starting from Biden era, the United States is gradually easing the restriction of Japanese military expansion. It is now accepting Japan not only as a military base for its most significant strategic assets like F-35, but also allowing Japan perhaps to come into the supply chain or the military supply chain of the overall U.S. build-out. So perhaps it is interpreted as Japan is not acting in a vacuum, it's acting with a perhaps implicit understanding or even acknowledgement or even encouragement by the U.S. in order to present a stronger military force to rebalance military powers in the East Pacific. Because we all know after the September 3rd, people now understand how strong PRC's military build-out has been, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. So perhaps dragging or pulling Japan into some kind of a rebalance, just like pulling South Korea into some kind of nuclear submarine build-out, would be to the best interest of the United States. It would strengthen its local allies without incurring greater military expenses. So all of this is factored in, and U.S. silence is probably interpreted as perhaps a understanding or silent encouragement, silent nudging of Japan moving in that direction.
What what did you see on social media and on Chinese-speaking media in Taiwan and the mainland about, how this is being portrayed now within the Sinosphere, within the Chinese-speaking media? I mean, I hear from my Chinese friends that this is huge. This is not just another kind of spat among the governments, but this really drills down to some core fears of the Chinese.
Well, Taiwan is divided. As I said earlier, some people actually said Japan has no business in intervening into the cross-strait situation, with Japan so strongly backing seemingly Lai Ching-de's Taiwan independence stance, it will reduce the flexibility of Taiwan in forming its own strategy and policy to deal with people across the Taiwan Strait. So that's one side, the worried side. The celebratory side said, okay, this is fantastic. And they have claimed that this is the most outspoken, most direct support of the current Lai Ching-de regime. And Lai Ching-de actually asked everybody to mobilize, to consolidate our support for such a great expression of support of Taiwan. So that's Taiwan. But in mainland China, I think the response, at least the stated response from the central government to local government to central media to local media to all kinds of media is universal. That is, we have not forgotten the blood shed during the Second World War, that Sino-Japanese War. Like I said earlier, over 30 million people wounded or direct casualties. Death or casualties were not to be forgotten. And also, do not forget that 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War, caused the colonization of Taiwan. And those 50 years, from 1895 to 1945, after the World War II, Taiwan was repatriated to China. But those 50 years is actually the root cause of Taiwan's current separatist movement from PRC. In those 50 years, the first stage was military aggression and massive massacres in Taiwan. Lots of people actually were killed. The numbers range from 400,000 to 600,000. The second stage is to dominate or use an administrative power to inculcate, to acculturate Taiwan, to acculturate Taiwan population to be more like Japanese. And the third stage is the royalist, quote unquote, stage. And during that time, some Taiwanese were pulled into the Japanese army. Others were given privileges to be part of the overall Japanese dominance or Japanese ring of influence in the Pacific. So the three stages to date are remnant in Taiwan, but the current Lai Ching-de government only celebrate the second and the third part. He clearly ignored the first part of the mass massacre. In that sense, for the Japan and Taiwan, there is a very strong, especially from Lai Ching-de's point of view, a very strong cultural affinity. So Takaishi's statement is not only seen as a political or military support of the current regime, but also a cultural and historical validation of the self-identity of those Taiwanese who have, in my view, imagined a glorious Japanese colonial rule period.
How do you see this play out? For China to issue a travel advisory and telling people not to go to Japan, and for airlines then to offer refunds to Chinese tourists, that's a huge step. And this is something that breaks, people to people links, right? And that's something that well, not just for economical reasons, but also for, just the way that these countries can interact with each other changes things. How do you see things developing?
Japan is edging up its pressure, and those coercive pressure is used very selectively. Japan has not reacted to any of them, so I expect this to escalate. One other historical fact was the 1895 war not only ceded Taiwan to Japan's colonial rule, but also gave Japan huge silver that funded Japan's industrialization and its modernization. And therefore, Japan was able to build a war machine against China. So all of this connected together will make Chinese government extremely careful. They will not accept a salami tactic of a salami revival of Japanese militarism. And therefore, I expect them to edge up their pressure in different way, shape, and form until the time that Takaishi actually made a reversal in her statement. But you understand Japan better than me. It would be a huge loss of face. So she needs to be smart. If she insisted on her current position, she's going to bring Japan into a very dangerous zone.
Yes, she will. On the other hand, she cannot back down from this. So the only way out would be a change of prime minister where the next one then can tone it down, which is not impossible, by the way, because she's extremely weak. It's a coalition government and she doesn't have a majority, but it doesn't look as if though she's losing anytime soon, but she's only been here for a month. What do you think that the reaction from around surrounding countries is now going to look like? Ms. Takaichi, for instance, she proposed a peace treaty with Russia, so she has tried to look reconciliatory with Russia. Do you expect something to come out of this?
Well, if we look at in a broad stroke, very broad stroke, there may be two strong coalitions in Asia. One is Japan and US, and the other would be China and Russia, even though they are not formally aligned, right? Military alignment is not there. However, they do, in the military exercise, they actually work shoulder to shoulder and the interoperability is extremely strong. So I can't imagine Russia acquiescing to Japan's request without consulting with China, especially at the time, this dynamic. So I expect Takaishi to face a lot of pressure, not just increasing pressure from China regarding her statement of Taiwan linking to Japan's survival, but also what about the 4 islands in the north? What about the island between Korea and Japan? Those are territorial disputes. And Japan has Senkaku Island, which is 钓鱼岛 dispute with China as well. So there are a lot of existing disputes, plus a new one, which is Ryūkyū, the Okinawa. So a new prime minister, without having solid support domestically, with a very, very strong population, which I think she had at one point, but it's now dwindling. And also her supporter seems to be a very young population, which has little historical memories or understanding of what happened to the wartime Japan. But if without an extremely solid support to confront multifaceted international crisis would be a disaster for any prime minister. So just imagine if the northern islands, the 4 islands in the north, has a problem. Sakhalin Islands have a problem. With Korea, the island has a problem. Senkaku Island, 钓鱼岛, has a problem. Ryūkyū has a problem. How would this prime minister deal with all these challenges in all different facets? So I think her best strategy is still trying to find a stepping stone to move down and ratchet down the current language and try to somehow make this statement a reversal.
You have also traveled to Japan and you know this region. Do you also share my impression that Japan has not enough historical appreciation for just how the Second World War is remembered outside? Because I must add one thing, Japan's pacifism is quite strong, or used to be quite strong. But what this means is that a lot of people now attribute, death with war. Death happens because of war. Japan doesn't say like death in China happened because of our soldiers. It happened because of war. Japanese people died in Hiroshima. Chinese people died in Nanjing. It's war. This leads to a lack of appreciation of how this is viewed on the other side. Do you share this?
Oh, absolutely. I think there is a very strong cohort effect. If you were born before the war, maybe you are now 80 and plus, you would have some firsthand understanding and may have your own conclusion. But the people who were born after the war, starting from 60-year-old to 70, 50 years old, a lot of them take a different position, saying that even though they may understand Japanese aggression toward other countries and territories in the region, they would say, oh, this is due to those militarists. That have nothing to do with the present Japan. In other words, war and remembrance in Japan has a chasm. They selectively remembered the nuclear Holocaust, the bombing of Tokyo, but they selectively neglected the aggression initiated by Japan by design and by their military armies, soldiers, and generals alike to cause extreme pain of other people in the region. So this selectivity, separated by different cohorts, people of different age, is extremely clearly for the youngest cohort. People supported Takashi Ishii has 18 to 34 as the strongest cohort supporting her. And that cohort has no recollection of what Japan has done during the war. Therefore, I don't think there is clear accountability, clear understanding and acceptance of responsibility like Japan's other allies, their Axis countries' counterpart, like Germany has done. Germany has accepted their war responsibility, has taken strong measures to make that country accountable to other developments in Europe. But Japan has enjoyed a protected position by design by the United States to be an Asian forefront for the US. And therefore, many of the people are shielded from the real war and remembrance. They have not accepted the responsibility, nor have the government, been accountable.
Plus, one more thing, which is that Japan had to deal with the challenge of being occupied by the previous enemy. And if you keep focusing on who bombed you, then naturally you would have to put a focus on the United States. But instead, they focused on war is bad, war is bad, war is bad. But that eliminates guilt. And what the Germans did, they went through the guilt question, is something the Japanese avoided largely. Not completely, but largely. And this is coming back to haunt us now. Where do you see a reasonable way out of this? Do you think we need a new discussion about history?
I think there is a need to have real, full-faceted recollection of what happened. I feel so sorry that we're talking about this. I have some really older Japanese gentlemen friends who are 90 years old, who were part of the pre-war generation that understand what Japan did. And they were very apologetic to the pain and suffering Japan caused China. And those generations are dying fast. Sorry to say, the new generation has no moral remorse, nor do they have any moral understanding of that guilt and responsibility. So your point is very, very well taken. But I think the problem is partly because of the cross-strait situation. The war was led primarily by the KMT government. Post-war power resides with the PRC government. So the two governments did not coincide in this in portraying a full picture of China's suffering and counterattack during 1931 to 1945. Little did these stories being told, and little did these stories being told in English. So I think the two governments, because of our own internal civil war situations, actually owe the world a full account of the Sino-Japanese War II, that is 1931 to 1945. And that would help us better understanding and attribute responsibility, guilt, and accountability.
and reconciliation. I mean, what would be needed would be a joint study groups in order to reconcile these different narratives.
And let me add one thing. I think we also need to draw in those Japanese scholars and, intellectuals who take the position that Japan is accountable and responsible for what happened during the war, for the pain and sufferings it caused. Those people, the moral voices in Japan, needs to be strengthened, reinforced, and be drawn into an intellectual world community for the completion of this story. The story on 731 Laboratory was given by a Japanese senator to the world. And I think those kind of actions, those really brave souls, give us hopes that history will finally tell the complete story and the true, full story.
I am worried that this dynamic that we are seeing now might already be leaving the realm of the work of historians, because, any Japanese scholar coming out and trying to do what you said will automatically be attacked by the right wing, and that will develop a political dynamic which will benefit them, and so on and so forth. So I wonder what you see as a pragmatic political tool that, for instance, the opposition force in Japan could use at the moment in order to undermine this dynamic where the right wing gets stronger, also by the left trying to do reconciliatory work.
Well, you are exactly right. That is what political correctness means. When a position is so strong that doesn't allow any other deviation, that makes it a tool to oppress the other people holding different point of view. And that we've seen in the world in many different societies and in many different eras. This is no surprise and no different from any others. But I'm an optimist. I believe that there's still small little light that can shade in the darkest night. So the kinds of brave moral position taken by some of the Japanese, because I don't want people to hate Japanese. I think there are people who really want to bring out the true history, and they're haunted by the hidden facts, by the fact that Japan didn't accept its guilt and its responsibility, its incredible cruel treatment of people around the world. Those people who are haunted by this fact need to be supported. If they are not supported in Japan, they can be supported by the international community at large. And I think, Pascal, what you're doing, I'm a big fan of yours. I think you're always taking that kind of position, taking position that's not quote unquote politically correct, but morally sound and historically grounded.
We need to figure out a way not to kill each other, because if we don't do a good job, that we will default back into. The problem I see now is that this rift, this big schism between China and Japan that's now seemingly breaking up again, is only playing into the hands of the dynamic of the people who try to split the globe itself, right? Of the West, together with Taiwan and Japan and the United States, against the China and Russia. So this is very unfortunate, actually.
Well, I have written an article recently that we are in Yalta 2.0. If you recall the Yalta 1.0, which is US versus USSR that ended in 1991, it is a global competition of two systems and selected nominee wars in select countries, right? So that's Yalta 1.0. Now we're in Yalta 2.0. We're still looking at a global competition between the geopolitical force dominated by the United States and geoeconomic force currently increasingly influenced by PRC. Then there are countries being selected as forefronts, flashpoints, to prove one system is better than the other. Let me digress a little bit. Venezuela is a good example. It is not about the sort of drug trade. It is about changing regime. It's a regime change plan. The regime will be changed, quote unquote, to the liking of the United States, and that's the whole purpose. So if we put everything in the bigger perspective, I think Asia, Southeast Asia, in a slightly better position because Asians have a long history of consensual decision-making in ASEAN, in RCEP, in more recent discussions, with the exception probably of Philippines. The other countries all work together, and they also are more economically linked with PRC. So we are looking at the race between two forces pulling the world in two different directions. To the extent that we allow political economic forces to dominate, to build infrastructure, to build digital networks, to allow developing of new markets, import and export free zones, and so on and so forth, we may be able to narrowly escape another big world Holocaust. But at this time, Takaishi is igniting a very dangerous bomb. Maybe she hasn't ignited yet, but she's holding a match very, very close to igniting this dangerous bomb. And we need to appease the situation and actually de-escalate as soon as possible. So let's move away from immediate danger. This is clear and present danger, and then work on a long-term competition or competitive strategy towards a world that's not going to allow us to kill ourselves. Because we know we created more weapons that are sufficient to kill the world many times. So the next world war will not be a war with survivors. We need to move away from that really bleak, unfortunate destiny.
I am not sure that she's aware just of how hot that match in her hand is burning. But I will try to find out, and we will discuss again. Joanna, people want to follow you. They should go to your X account, or where should they follow you?
I typically go to ICT's Sunday night program. That's probably where they can find me. Thank you so much. And thank you, Pascal, for always picking the right topic, which are worth discussing internationally.
Well, thank you for that, Joanna Lei. Have a very good evening.
Bye-bye.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌帮助了睡眠品质。现在呢，进一步推出晚安加强版，添加了首创最适合台湾人体质的天然 GABA、色氨酸、茶氨酸、香蜂草4大天然草本助眠配方，强化睡眠全期都起到放松舒眠的效果。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它本身就含有台大专利授权克菲尔乳杆菌 M1 等8种专利菌，首创益生菌、益生元、后生元黄金3角配方，帮助维持消化道的机能。有季节敏感、代谢困扰、关心异常细胞风险的好朋友呢，可以选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有超级食物羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。选择太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，做好日常保养，实现睡眠自由，身体轻松无负担。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。